I'm here with Ray Cameron, who heads America's stewardship team at Blackrock, and Aeisha Mastagni, who is portfolio manager at CalSTRS, the California State Teachers Retirement System. Thanks for joining me. Just a few questions on environmental, social, and governance issues. ESG has clearly become a mainstream issue for institutional investors, so maybe I could ask you to start, Ray. How is Blackrock looking at ESG, and why is it important for investors?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. When Blackrock thinks about ESG, we actually think that the order is wrong. We think it should be GES, because governance is really the anchor. And without good governance, it is questionable, or it's unlikely that you'll actually have sustainability around the E and the S. We also ask questions just around ESG or GES through the lens of how it impacts the overall operations and the long-term viability and sustainability of the company. It's not, a surprise that governance has been talked about for a very long time, and so the dimensions around what good governance looks like are far more established, if you will, than the E and the S. In addition to that, sometimes when we get into kind of the environmental and the social issues, the metrics in terms of how those items are measured are not as advanced. And so there can be a very wide swath in terms of how companies may respond to those questions. We try not to be too prescriptive in terms of our questions around the E and S, though we are certainly interested in how the board and the companies are thinking about these topics and how they get their arms around them, particularly as it relates to risk for the companies. And in addition to that, we found, at least right now, that when you start to think about environmental and social issues, or you start questions around it, we tend to keep our questions at a broad level because they can very quickly get to an operational level that we really think is really in the purview of the management of the company to really focus on. But there are certainly evolving standards with respect to environmental and social, and we tend to support additional disclosures and metrics around that.
And Aeisha, in terms of ESG at CalSTRS, how are you looking at it?
Similar to what Ray was saying, governance is all about an evolution. Things that were common practice 10, 15 years ago are not common practice today. The disclosures are getting better. And we at CalSTRS, been somewhat disheartened that they've split up the E, S, and G into different categories, because we believe governance is all about managing risk, whether that be an environmental risk, a social risk, because these things can all have an effect on the financial statements and have a material effect on the value of these companies. So we engage on all of these issues because it's important to make sure that we have a secure retirement for our teachers in California.
Whether it's through what a company is disclosing or through your engagement, what are the signals to you that companies are taking ESG issues seriously and integrating them into their strategy?
Well, that the conversation around ESG is obviously continuing to evolve. And as I mentioned earlier, the components of governance are pretty well established because that's been a focal point of conversations for a very long time. On the E and the S side, there are just evolving standards in terms of disclosures and metrics, and we're supportive of some of those. What I would feel comfortable in saying is that typically these conversations around the operational risks that are inherent in environmental and social issues, most companies, and particularly the boards, have actually thought about them. They may be reluctant somewhat to disclose all the metrics that they use around it, but there's a conversation around it. And I think what's happening with most boards and companies is an increasing level of where their line is in terms of comfort around disclosures, and I think that's evolving.
So Aeisha, when you're engaging with companies, when you're looking through disclosure, how are the ESG issues really being communicated in an effective way?
I think first and foremost, it's about companies being responsive to the shareholders and investors. We've periodically sent letters to companies, whether it be on board composition, which you could sort of file under the S category, or diversity. And when we don't get a response from the company, that's usually a pretty good indication that they're not paying attention to these issues. They're not willing to have a dialogue. So that's the first point. I think the other thing is that a lot of these issues are very industry specific. There are risks, especially under environmental or sustainable issues, that affect certain industries more than others. And I think it's great if companies sort of look at really what are those risks that are material to their company that could affect them on a financial basis. And it's about disclosing those. I think there are a lot of great companies and really good examples out there of companies that have produced sustainability reports and made them available to their shareholders or their investors. And I think that's a good indicator for us of companies that are really thinking thoughtfully about these things.